Hi again then guys, and before we get into the meat of this game review, I do need to quickly address the obvious, and that is that my voice sounds different in this video. That's because I'm currently sick. Hopefully not for too much longer, and that's why I have this smooth Apple 104.4 radio voice. But as we get into the meat of the review itself, of course, this review is technically late. I never really review games as soon as they come out, unless it's a car game, but I like to review games that capture my attention, sometimes a few months old, sometimes a few years old, and this one definitely speaks to certain gameplay mechanicals and sensibilities of a story and an idea, which I love. Because for those who don't know, I am a massive Fallout fan. Fallout 4 in particular is easily in my top 5 favourite games ever, on any console. And I'm always looking for another game which has that kind of experience. And there are some which I haven't tried, but as I said, it needs to capture my interest and my imagination for me to even try the game 9 times out of 10, and this one certainly did. I saw the advertising and the trailers before it came out. I wanted to give it a try, but usually I will wait for the initial reviews to pass, see what some of the footage looks like, and then maybe buy it when it's, used a little bit cheaper or whatever, and that is what I did here with The Outer Worlds. Now, The Outer Worlds was, as I believe I mentioned just now, released in October of last year, 2019, so it's, 3-4 months old-ish at the time of releasing this video, and in terms of the development of the game, it has a lot of bright minds and good companies behind it. It's got the Unreal game engine, it was developed by Obsidian, and the two directors of the game were even part of the creative team behind Fallout. So that's pretty good, it's pretty stellar. Or you could say pretty interstellar. But as far as this game goes, the idea behind it, I think, is a good one. It's got its heart in the right place, it's a charming game, it's fun, and I would say it's a decent game. It's not a great one, but I did have fun with it. I completed it in 2 or 3 days through the main story, so it certainly doesn't take as long as a Fallout game does. But I do have some overwhelming positives and maybe some drawbacks to this game, which I think if you are a potential buyer like myself who likes to wait a little bit and get some of the after-the-fact reviews before actually making the decision to purchase a game, well then this review is for you. Because going into this game, I believe my expectations may have been a little bit too high, because it certainly looks like a fantastic game in terms of scope and creativity and the sci-fi side of things, and I love the idea of having essentially a Fallout game in space. It's a great idea. Sci-fi is referenced a lot in Fallout, but it's not really delved into. It's mostly post-apocalyptic survival with some horror elements, but not really too much in that regard. Far Harbor, for instance, in Fallout 4. But as far as this game goes, the deliberate idea behind it was they wanted it to have a mix of drama and silliness, and that certainly comes through. The game has some very good themes, some great story points, and I believe that the overarching story of the game, especially as you get toward the end, is pretty cool. And like Fallout, it has a lot to say about society in real life, about big corporations, about governments, about the way they treat people, how the average Joe is actually considered by the government, not as an individual who is valuable to them, but as an asset who is to be worked. The world is basically a big old ant hive, and this is how it works. The game, just like Fallout, has a definite commentary on that, and it's not just the government, it's the corporations, these companies. You can swap out Vault-Tec for Apple, you can swap out Nuka-Cola for Coca-Cola or Pepsi, and in this game there are plenty of companies that you can do that with as well. Now, there's no specific crossover with Fallout that I noticed, but as I said, nothing that really stood out to me that I noticed. In terms of how the game feels, the mechanics, the graphics, the gameplay itself, well, the graphics, I would say, are passable. They're not amazing. The colours are the colours are a little bit too bright, a little bit too vivid, which sounds like a strange qualm to have. You'd kind of think you'd want that in an alien sci-fi game, but I think that there's a point where you can go a little bit over the top, and this game does that sometimes. Some of the worlds and some of the locations are great. There's a ship, for instance, called the Groundbreaker, and it's great. It looks cool. It looks like something out of Aliens. Fantastic. But then you've got other planets, and I don't recall all of the names, but some of the other planets are just straight up like a children's colouring book. It's way over the top in terms of colours, and although that does add to the inherent silliness of the game, it does kind of draw you out of when the game's trying to be a little bit more serious in tone, because some of the themes here are very serious. class differences, religious differences, government, corporation stuff that I already talked about. And when you mix messages like that with the silliness and the seriousness, it can sometimes undermine both. It would be kind of like, for instance, if Road Trip Adventure had the option to do a drive-by shooting. It just doesn't really fit in with the theme of the game. Or if Grand Theft Auto had, like, mini golf with Mario. Sure, but it's not really what the game is about. So, in terms of playing the game, as I said, the mechanics, the physics, it very, very much reminded me in terms of the fighting mechanics and the enemies and the weapons of two games in particular, which I did enjoy. Black Site Area 51, which I incidentally played through on this channel in a 5-part series, and also the Resistance Fall of Man series. There are a lot of similarities in the kind of fighting and weapon and enemy mechanics. You would expect a game like this to have dozens of different creatures and monsters and enemies on different planets. They are entirely different ecosystems after all, and that was one of the disappointing things for me, because despite all of the different potential creatures, you find that you come across pretty much the same 3 enemies all the time. Marauders, which are people, I guess, which are basically kind of like the raiders in Fallout crossed with ferals. You've then got a kind of saber-toothed dog, which are just a minor nuisance once you get a decent weapon. And then you've got these like spitting lizard things which show up all over the place. Now, there are others that you come across, but not much. Those are the vast 3 that you see in every world in the game. And to me, that's a little bit disappointing, because you've got a very real opportunity here to have completely different creatures and aliens on each planet. And they just don't do that. And it comes off as a little lazy. Plus, then we come to another aspect of what could be perceived as laziness, and I would understand that argument even if I wouldn't necessarily agree with it, and that is the worlds themselves. Yes, technically you can fly between like 8 or 9, I think, different planets in the Halcyon solar system, which is a cool idea, but in reality, I'm pretty sure that if you combined the areas of those planets that you can actually walk on and put them all together, it would probably still be smaller than Fallout 4's map. Because Fallout 4 is pretty huge, especially if you count all of the interiors of the buildings as well. This, to me, doesn't feel bigger than that. You might initially think it does, but if you actually go through it in your mind and think of where you can actually walk on these planets, it's not like you're exploring an entire planet. It actually suffers from something which I like to call the Forza Horizon effect, and that is that in the first Forza Horizon racing game, it's technically a free-roaming map, but it's actually not, because all of the roads pretty much have railings and walls next to them, so you actually can't free roam. It's just a big interconnecting series of roads. You compare that to Forza Horizon 3 or 4, that is a free roaming map. Test Drive Unlimited, that is a free roaming map. Go off-road at any time, go overland, true free roaming. This world is not truly a free roaming game. There are tons of places and plenty of worlds where you're basically just on a path, and that's it. You can't really stray from it that much. Especially, for instance, the planet that you start the game on. Each planet in the game genuinely feels just like a series of interconnected roads with a central hub, with a bunch of characters who need you to do semi-pointless side missions, and a couple of characters who you might be able to recruit to your team. And I will say, that was one of the aspects of the game that I did love. I love the side characters, they're all very interesting, very cool. You've got robots, mechanics, like lugheads who are just good with a hammer kind of thing. It's a cool little team that you can build. I like the idea of having a central ship that you can like jump between these different planets in. It had a very homely feel, and I like that, kind of like your garage in a racing game. But as far as the overall meshing together of the ideas, I think that's where it falls apart a little bit, because for me, I do like this game, and I actually would recommend playing it, but it's not the kind of game that I'd recommend, and it's not like it matters now, but I wouldn't recommend buying it new. I would definitely say you should do what I did, which is wait for it to be a little bit cheaper, second-hand, a used game instead. That's a far better option here, because everything in the game is good enough, but there's nothing, to me, that was great about it. It's easily overshadowed by Fallout, and of course that's not an entirely fair comparison, but at the same time, to me that speaks to the biggest single issue with this game. It feels like it should have come out 10 years ago. If this game had come out in 2010, it would have been phenomenal. But it didn't. It came out at the end of 2019, and the simple thing is, it feels dated. So ultimately this review is, as you can tell, it's a mix of both. I loved, or liked, or respected, even, certain aspects of the game, and there were other parts that I didn't like. There was nothing that I hated as such. There's only one real boss fight in the entire game, and although you could consider this a minor spoiler, it's a location spoiler, and not really, you don't need to skip the video or anything. On the map, there's just a certain planet that is locked. You can't go there. It's called Tartarus, which is a biblical reference, and Tartarus is a prison planet. And the problem with this Tartarus, and again this falls under the thematic problems that the game has with trying to be dramatic and silly at the same time, is that if you read the write-up about this planet in the game, they make it seem like a literal hell. They make it sound like Mustafar from Star Wars, where Darth Vader lives. Just lava everywhere, probably pterodactyls flying around, black clouds, thunderstorms coming out of nowhere. It just ain't like that. You get to the prison planet and it's barely even a prison. There's supposed to be something like 3,000 people in this prison. You don't see a single prisoner. I mean, anti-spoiler, I guess, is like the opposite of a spoiler. But yeah, it's easily the most overhyped part of the game. It's just a building, basically. It doesn't feel like a prison even at all. It just feels like a medical facility it could have easily been mistaken for. So don't get your hopes up for the prison planet. In terms of boss fights, again, don't get your hopes up. And there's an interesting little couple of ideas in terms of weaponry and tactical stuff that you can do. There's actually something called tactical time dilation, which you get right at the start of the game. And it's basically an ability that you can do which slows down time for a few seconds. I think it's up to like 2 minutes or so. You can use that in the game, and it's a cool idea, but I literally only used it once in the entire game, and it was just for a robot boss fight. Apart from that, I never needed it. So overall, to me, The Outer Worlds is a game which definitely has its heart in the right place. It's got tons of charm, some really cool characters. It's definitely reminiscent of Fallout 3, even more than Fallout 4. It's certainly a game that appeals to like the 2000s era and maybe even older for some people, so it's got that retro style. It has a very similar Fallout like reimagining of reality kind of thing, where it is set in space, but at the same time some things are kind of old-fashioned, like 50s alternate reality. I love that kind of stuff, you know, steampunk, cyberpunk. So yeah, it's a great little game in its own way. Don't expect too much of it. Definitely don't pay full price for it, and I am very curious to see actually if there will be a second game. And the final piece of advice that I would give as a reward to people who have watched this far in the review is I'll give you a very beneficial tip when playing through this game. This is not a spoiler, it's just a tactical tip. Do not go to Tartarus until you've done everything else, because just like Fallout 3, you can't go back. So make sure that you do that unless you want to load up a previous save, which kind of makes it pointless to go to Tartarus in the first place. So that is my big tactical tip that I would give. Trust me, you'll be grateful for that one when you play through the game. And in terms of my overall score, well, I don't do scores, so go and check out the game. That's my review, and of course, click here on screen to see my other reviews of various games as well. Not just car stuff, I've reviewed some other games as well. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.